Everybody, and welcome to day 18. I'm starting to see the finish line in the foreground. I can't believe we are on our penultimate day of VID21. If this is your first session, welcome. If you are returning, welcome back. It's always great to see familiar names in the chat. For people that don't know me, my name is Julia Steele. I'm the creator and host, and we're in for a bit of a treat this lunchtime if you're in Melbourne, because we're joined by the wonderful Cameron Schwab. Cameron, after cutting his teeth as a recruiter at Melbourne Football Club, when the Demons made the finals for the first time in 22 years, Cameron was appointed CEO of the famous Richmond Football Club at the age of 24, the youngest in the history of the game. For most of the next 25 years, he was the CEO of Richmond, Melbourne and Fremantle when those clubs were at their lowest ebb, both on and off the field. He's the second longest serving CEO in the modern game. And having taken on some of the sport's most difficult and daunting challenges, Cam's established a track record of building teams and organisations, unifying groups when navigating periods of genuine adversity and complexity. And Cameron is now a leadership mentor and strategist, as well as being an artist and illustrator studying fine art at the Victorian College of the Arts, VCA. Cameron, you spoke last year and everyone loved it, and so glad to have you back. You're also one of the people, or the main person, that gave me the idea for this and contributed a wonderful chapter. So thank you so much for always contributing to this conversation. And a lot's changed since VID19, so interested to see what you've got to say about.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful to be here, and a few familiar faces too as well. And it's always, even in this environment, I heard it recently. It was actually I love David White's work, and WHYTE, and I will quote him a few times as we go through this. One thing he says is, are you in a position, are you prepared to actually, when you pick up a book, read a book, when you put yourself into this type of environment, are you prepared to actually have your thoughts replaced by someone else's thoughts for the next period of time? In this case, 45, 50, 60 minutes. And they're just my thoughts. That's all they are. And your thoughts are always changing. Your thoughts are always evolving. But even that practice of learning, and the environment I come from, which is elite sport, is unapologetically about learning. And I think perhaps that's where business can learn most from sport, which is not necessarily, everyone thinks about sport, the learnings of business and sport as it relates to performance, but I think it's about the environment that we create to create the performance being the outcome. And I think it's the learning. How do we actually go about that? And even as a young leader, and which I'll reference back to, is that the learning piece took too long for that little penny to drop, that I had expectations of the environment that the coaches would create for the young footballers who were coming into the environment, as opposed to the environment I was creating as a CEO for the people in and around the organisation. And generally I found that you recruit people on the basis of a skill set, but it was actually they would survive in the role on the basis of a behavioural set. And so yes, we focus very strongly on the coaching of the skills, but really we should be coaching in many cases the behaviours. And in the AFL with the men's teams, we recruit the most selfish human beings known to mankind, being the 18-year-old male, and the first thing we have to educate them on is selflessness. So that is a behavioural aspect to it. And if that penny doesn't drop, if they don't learn that, well, they can't actually survive the system. So thanks very much, Julia, and congratulations on the work you're doing. This is an unbelievably generous offering for people, and I know that there's a deep appreciation of it. I've titled, and I've given this a bit of thought as to how I wanted to focus this. I've titled this In the Arena, and the main reason and the thinking behind that is that I think the minute that you actually take any role of responsibility, you're effectively putting yourself in the arena. And I've chosen this photo quite deliberately because it's after last year's grand final, and it's the great Gary Ablett, champion Geelong player, who's just played his last game of AFL football, and his day didn't end, or probably didn't even start the way that he intended. He actually injured his shoulder in the first minute of the game, and wasn't able to have the impact on the game that he would have liked, and either on his own behalf, but certainly on behalf of his teammates. And Geelong lost the grand final. And this is a photo which is it's not unique, as in the game's very good at celebrating its great champions, and he's receiving a sort of a guard of honour to come off the ground for his last game. But what makes the photo unique is it's the first time I've ever seen it in a grand final or a major event, and it was actually an offering made by Richmond to celebrate, the champion Geelong player. And even in the context of that, to have, because the grand final is normally about the victor and the vanquished, if you like, the great events, the winning and the losing. The scoreboard tells the story, particularly on grand final day. It's an ultimate story in lots of ways. But it's also Richmond's third premiership in the last 4 years. And I grew up as a Richmond person. My father, Alan Schwab, was secretary of Richmond, and they grew up with this attitude of ruthlessness that was known as ruthless Richmond. The interesting thing about the Richmond team of today is that its number one value is humility, and they've won 3 of the last 4 grand finals. And this is a display of humility in many ways, but also it's beautifully generous. And I think humility and generosity are very aligned. But what makes the event a little bit unique is that the Richmond players have already received their premiership medallions, and they've already received their silverware, their premiership cup, but they're nowhere to be seen in this photo, because the Richmond players have actually tucked their premiership medallions into their jumpers. And that was something which was modelled by, they've got a wonderful player, Dustin Martin. He comes from a really rough background, really tough background. When he was drafted, it was never on the basis of the leadership that he was likely to show. It was certainly on the skills that he actually brought. But what he's actually done is he's created a behaviour which has actually modelled this behaviour, because because he's actually won 3 of the last 4 in the premierships that Richmond have won. He received the Norm Smith medal for being the best player on the ground. And immediately once he's received his medal, he tucks it into his jumper, and the only medal he has on display is his premiership medallion. So it's about the team. And ultimately it's about the team. That is the behaviour we're coaching more than anything. That's selfish to selfless behaviour. And so the modelling of what's actually happened here has come from the person who, perhaps when he was drafted as an 18-year-old lad, was thought to be the least likely player for that to actually happen. And this wasn't a directive from a president or a coach or a CEO or anything like that. It actually came from the player group itself. And you have a wonderful culture inside a group when you're seeing these unexpected forms, and you could never sort of predict this type of scenario playing out for you. And you've built a culture. And so it might have actually had its origins in the efforts of the most senior leaders within the organisation, but it's now playing out at this wonderful level, and it creates this huge image. And as proud as they were, I'm sure, to take home the Premiership Cup, I think they'd be equally as proud of this moment. And the reason in the arena is, I think, just a wonderful way of thinking, and it comes from this line. I know Brene Brown's really embraced this. It's the Theodore Roosevelt speech, and I won't read it all out now, but it's based on the critic, and probably growing up in a sport which has enormous amount of media scrutiny, if you like, and the media scrutiny normally sits in the heroes and villains world, as in someone's either this or they're that, whereas a leadership world sits in the middle of nuance. And if you can't build the nuance, and knowing that you're putting yourself into a world which is about heroes and villains, but really your world's about nuance, but you're going to be judged at that level. And this line I love in it is, it's not the critic who counts, the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena. And in the arena means that you're going to win and you're losing. And in fact, the role of leadership, if we're doing the job properly, is actually facing into ambiguity all the time. The role of the critic, if you like, is to sit in judgment of the person who sits in that place of ambiguity. And with a vision of hindsight, will actually say whether you've got it right or whether you've got it wrong. And it brings to mind this wonderful image. And this guy's named Siya Khaleesi. And Siya Khaleesi captained South African rugby to their World Cup victory just a couple of years ago. It seems a lifetime ago, given what's happened in the world during that period of time. But Siya Kolisi's got a wonderful story and one of great challenges and one of almost ordeal in some ways. And the interesting thing about even the notion of ordeal, and there's a wonderful book by Matthew McConaughey, you know, when you get unexpected learnings from unexpected places. And I found myself just listening to a podcast, and Matthew McConaughey, he's, you know, Academy Award-winning actor, all those sorts of things. And he's got this beautiful way of saying things. Clearly, he's an actor, and he's got this Texan drawl. And one of the lines he says, there's angels of truth everywhere. There's angels of truth everywhere, but we only tend to access them when we're going through difficult times. One of the things for all of us is how do we actually make ourselves accessible to those angels of truth when things aren't, when it's not, we're not going through ordeal. You know, whilst I understand that deeper learning will come from the ordeal, you know, you can actually access wisdom and understanding at other times. And Siya Kolisi was almost saying that in a moment of victory, because his reference is his moments of ordeal. He lost his mother young. He grew up in poverty, but ends up being a black man taking, you know, in an apartheid country, taking his team to an unexpected World Cup victory. And in the speech afterwards, he basically, when he could have been easily forgiven for being quite indulgent in that moment, he basically said, if this team can do it with all the adversity that we've gone through and the cross-cultural and the varying backgrounds that we've all got, well, our country can do it as well. And really, and it brought to mind this line, the difference between what truly matters and what seems to matter. And there's a line that I love is, if we get to understand what truly matters, we get to enjoy what seems to matter. And what he was saying is, yes, this victory, we're going to enjoy it, no doubt about that. But what truly matters is what it actually means to our country. And from a leadership point of view and sitting in the arena, it's often understanding the difference between the truly matters and what seems to matter. And anyone who's been to the MCG will know that what actually seems to matter is the big scoreboard there. But often as a leader and a CEO, what truly matters for me might be some of the development of the young men, for instance, who are playing for your club, who you see evolve. You know, what truly matters maybe more the development of Dustin Martin into the leader than he is than the premiership itself. And it mightn't feel that way at different times. And just before Gary Ablett receives his Guard of Honour, this is an image which was taken just moments before. And he's been asked to go into the Guard of Honour at this stage. And I just love the photo. He's just been over his wife. He's gone to see his wife and his little boy, and the look on the little boy's face. But anyone who knows the backstory to this is, unfortunately, that little boy is desperately ill. And from what I understand, and I don't know exactly the prognosis, he's not going to have a long life. He's not going to have a long life. And so Gary Ablett's facing into his own mortality as an athlete and knowing that he's going to actually really draw into, you know, he's going to have to create a second life for himself, a second identity for himself. And a wonderful mentor of mine, a fellow named Alan Jeans, used to say, a footballer dies twice. And we have high expectations that somehow someone can have a wonderful identity in the sport. They can be aligned, every aspect of their life can be aligned to performance at that level, of which he did better than probably 99.9% of the players who have ever played the game. But he's now at 35 years of age, having to create a new life for himself, but also facing into that life, knowing, you know, the challenges that they've actually got. And what I also understand is this: ultimately, it will be the hard days that define us. And I reference those hard days in the conversations I have. And as mentioned before, I'm a practicing artist, and I don't hold this particular drawing as any piece of wonderful art or anything like that, but it reflects my frame of mind at the time. Because one of the things which, and I talk openly about it, in my 20s, and I was still a CEO at the time, I got diagnosed with clinical depression. And it's not a diagnosis which I know I have a cure for, if you like. I have to constantly work on it. And when I got diagnosed with clinical depression, trying to find my own identity, and it actually related to me actually getting the sack as a CEO, and realizing that all the things I identified myself with no longer existed. And I actually had enormous fears for the future. I was almost ashamed of my past and had no hope for the future. And that's a really dangerous place to be for someone who has potentially, the challenge of depression. And I remember reading this book, and it was called The Last Lecture. And it's a really powerful book. And it's a guy who knows he's dying of cancer. And he's got these two young kids, and he's having to have this. He's been asked to do one more lecture, and he's a university lecturer. And he's got this challenge: because he's going to have to put a lot of work into this, or do I spend the time with my two young kids and my wife who have got to get on with their life without me? And he makes the choice, having had these conversations with his wife, that the legacy he would like, because his kids will have no memory of him, is that he wants to give them something that they can remember him by. So he does his one lecture. And I remember reading, and this had a profound effect on me at the time, this simple quote: "What do I alone truly have to offer? What is it that makes me alone?" And I've done this drawing with this, and I've called this drawing that. And I actually did originally have eyes in the drawing. And when I actually and I wasn't well, I had lost a lot of weight, I wasn't in a good place. And I remember getting the eraser out and actually rubbing out my eyes, because I didn't have a sense of what I alone truly had to offer. Because I alone, what I truly had to offer, I had always seen through the game itself. And it's interesting that there's a lovely line, which is, "What we love reveals who we are. What we love reveals who we are." And what I loved was the game of Australian football, which I'd grown up with from the day that I watched my first game holding my father's hand. And I'd managed to live my life through the game. And now it wasn't there for me. So what is it that I alone truly have to offer? And then I faced into a similar situation only 12 months ago, and Julian knows my background in regard to this, that I got diagnosed with cancer. And so I picked up the book again, because I had genuine fears that I wasn't going to survive this. As it turned out, I think I'm on track. I think I'm okay. And I did a drawing. And this is the drawing that I did at that stage. And it's an old man licking an ice cream. And it's a reference to my grandfather, who, as I've got older, I realise I'm looking more and more like, but it's also the nostalgia of our life. And what it is, he'd dress up in his full kit, because he served in the war. He'd dress up in his full suit to go to the RSL. And I remember, it wouldn't matter if it was 40 degrees in Melbourne, he'd still have his suit and his tie. And he'd come round to our house with a tub of Neapolitan ice cream when he'd left. And my sister would get the chocolate, my brother would get the vanilla, and I'd get the strawberry in the middle. And it's an old man with some strawberry ice cream in his hand. And it could be my grandfather, who we call Puppy, but it's actually me at some stage in the future. And it was at a time when I wasn't sure that I had a future, when I actually did the drawing. And so the thing that came to mind is, I still have a lot of talking to do, or I still had a lot of talking to do in regard to the conversations that we should be actually having. And so being able to reflect that, and then actually even in the reference back, because this is the day that I was appointed as the CEO of the Mighty Tigers, and it was a dream job. And I remember actually when my father had gone from being the secretary of the Richmond Football Club like I had, and I used to visit him when I was a young kid. I'd go into the offices, and this is me in my Richmond jumper as a young fella. And I'd go into the office, and we'd talk. And I know it was the best days of my whole childhood, was spending my time around the Pont Road Oval. Then at only 24 years of age, and I look at this photo and I look like a kid in a guy in a boy band or something like that at the time, you know. But it feels like it was yesterday in lots of ways. But so does that photo up in the top corner of me in the tiger jumper. It just feels like it was yesterday. And I remember having a conversation with my dad when I was offered the role, and he was executive commissioner of the AFL at this point in time. And I remember saying to him, I said, "Dad, I don't think it's a very good job, because the Tigers were on the bones of their bum. They were last on the ladder. They were going broke." And without any negativity implied in this comment, I remember my dad saying, "You reckon if it was a good job, they'd be offering it to you? You reckon if it was a good job, they'd be offering it to you?" And it was so real what he was actually saying. So I set myself this little task. I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be a great leader. And I'd never led anything in my life. I wasn't the kid who grew up as the captain of the footy team or the prefect at school or anything like that. And this was the first mistake I made. It wasn't about being a great leader. It was about this. It was actually, how do you become a great learner? And then a few years later, no, not a few years later, 25 years later, I've got this page in my notebook which looks just like this. And by this time, I'm the CEO of the Melbourne Football Club. But this is the day I got the sack. It's my last day in football. Because what I worked out was that in this idea of being a great leader, I thought that would be a wonderful thing to do, something to do. But to be a great leader, it has to be for you something to in fact be. And I've got this little framing on learning. I've actually gone deep into learning. This notion of, are you prepared to have your thoughts replaced by someone else's thoughts, so you can actually make sense of those thoughts? You can actually take that learning, what their lived experience is, whether it's the Matthew McConaughey book, whether it's the conversations you're having. And I've got this little simple framework, which looks a little bit like this. If you're just to draw a circle for you, if you're just to draw a circle for yourself and say, I think of it not just on what you're prepared to learn, but what you're prepared to teach. So even out of today, if there's one thing you can take from this and say, I am going to pass this on to someone else, because the thing that you pass on to something else will be more than your knowledge. It'll be your wisdom, because you've aligned some new piece of thinking or something which is actually accentuated or amplified a piece of your current thinking, and you've turned your knowledge into wisdom. And I love that concept of knowledge into wisdom. So how do we actually go about learning? And I reckon there's fundamentally 4 ways by which we do it. And the first one, and 2 of them, is about it's a conscious process here. The first one I just say is simply conversations with wise people. Do you consciously create conversations with wise people? Make a list of them. The people you know will be generous, and these people have to have an insight that is helpful to you, but also prepared to have integrity for the conversation, because a wise conversation will, by definition, mean you'll have to go deep. You cannot go forward without going deep. And in fact, the further I go in life, the more I realize is that I don't meet many interesting people who haven't gone deep. And the reason I have great respect for Julia is I know she's gone deep. And so they've got an insight as well as an integrity for the conversation that you're having. But I had even a more recent example of this. I ended up going back to uni as part of my evolution of my new identity, if you like, beyond the game, my something to be thing. I'm up studying fine art at the Victorian College of the Arts, and that time of my life also coincided with my youngest son, Lockie, at 17 years of age, coming to me and saying, "Dad, I'm changing gender." So my youngest son, Lockie, is now my youngest daughter, Evie. And I reckon that was a thing where there's no doubt we were going to support her. We were no doubt we're going to encourage her to go with the identity, because one thing I've worked out is that fitting in is very different to belonging. You know, you need to be, belonging is an energizing thing. Fitting in just sucks the energy out of you. And she'd spent probably her puberty trying to fit in and realised she didn't, and now she's actually worked out where she belongs. But from a parenting point of view, all of a sudden I'm in a situation I'm not sure how to parent her through this. And as it turned out, I've got 3 transgender kids in the first class that I'm in at Victorian College of the Arts, who then become my conversation with wise people. They're the people I'm talking about. How do I parent my child to these other 18-year-old kids? And they're just unbelievably wonderful. So are you putting yourself in conversation with wise people is number 1. Number 2 is really this environment. It's the learning that we do. It's the books. It's the podcasts. It's the online, whatever form of learning that you're actually creating for yourself. And I can't remember who exactly said it, but I think it's something like you're the same person in 20 years other than the people you meet and the books that you read. But I'd say in all of this, slow down this process. Not just think of it in the context of volume of books, volume of stuff. Are you prepared to take 5 minutes at the end of that piece of reading that you've done, or the end of the day, or to actually record what impact it's had on you? Not just what you've read, but what is your thinking and feeling from what you've read? If there's anything here today, it might be a quote, a line, an idea. The idea is that you actually now somehow enrich yourself and enrich others with that piece of learning. And so these things are then about how the inputs, but then we've got to create the space for it. And that's my third piece, is how are you creating space for this stuff? Are you slowing down your life? Are you bringing your attention back into a place, whether it's through, and I use meditation, 20 minutes every day, but I'm huge on journaling. that everything I teach, everything I've got in it has all come out of a journal at some stage. And it's mainly storytelling. I build on a story. I don't think you clearly can't change the past, but you can create meaning from the past. And even if someone says the past is 2020 vision in the past, it's not 2020 vision. It's your recall of that thing. And because I've done a fair bit of writing and I've talked, family becomes a big part of it. Every so often I'll say to my sister or someone, my brother, and say, this is what happened. And their recall's totally different to mine because they've got the lens by which we learn is so different. But slowing down to actually do this is just the fundamental of it all. And the fourth one is just then, how do you actually create for yourself feedback? Because we learn by having and creating feedback as in self-analysis, but also, again, those conversations with wise people is then an external analysis. You're covering your basis in those senses. And the feedback comes through, the formal versions of it, as in seeking and creating conversations with people, but it's also trying new things and experiment in some shape or form. If there's an idea which comes from today, experiment with it, try something, do something different, see if it works for you. And all of this will only happen is if you bring a mindset, which is in fact one of the learner, the Carol Dweck learner mindset. You cannot do, no one can do your learning for you. You have to take full responsibility for your learning. And as leaders, people who are in leadership roles, that becomes even more important because it's very difficult to create feedback loops for yourself as a learner because no one tells the CEO their baby's ugly, in my experience. It's one of those things where you have to be able to create your own learning for you. And so this is the framework now where I basically, on a weekly basis, tick off how did I go with all of those things. And if they're not on your to-do list, you probably haven't had the week you could have had. So leadership is not something to do, it's something to be. And one of the things I would say, even coming out of today, is I love this line: borrow freely, apply uniquely. Borrow the other information to you, but apply it to your own story. Apply it to where you're actually going. Apply it to your understanding. You know, when you pick something up and you read something, you go, that person has just made sense for me of something that happened in my life 20 years ago. And there's something beautiful inside that. So the borrowing, grab it. And so this comes from a place of generosity. Grab screens, grab whatever you can. Because I've actually, big chances I've borrowed it from someone else. I'd like to think I've applied it uniquely in terms of my own context in that way. And so one of the questions I'd ask you is, what is your strategy for building the skills you need for the life you want? And one of the things that I worked out, because I have had access to, because of the environment that I've been in, the most talented people who, through our game, that the game can actually produce. And one of the things I worked out really quickly is talent does not equal skill. Talent does not equal skill. Certainly there are some people who are given, they've been gifted, but it doesn't necessarily mean they create the skills which their situation requires from them. And that's why I came right from the very start. This was never about being a great leader. It was always about being a great learner. What is the skill you need? What do you need to be good at? And then going deep into that. And it's very hard to be good at something you don't really care for or that you love. What we love reveals who we are. And what I'd say is there is a story so far for everyone here. And the story so far is like our because story. I'm here because. But I think there's a beyond story, which is very powerful, which is your not yet story. So we've got a so far story, and we've all got a not yet story. And to get to the not yet story is taking ourselves from the because to the beyond, but you have to become in the meantime. And so what I would say in all of this, and this comes very much from elite sport, is to win the moment, you have to be in the moment. And so one of the things that we challenge ourselves now is to be in the moment. And I just tested myself out on this. I got on a trainer this morning, as in a bike. I often train indoors on the bike, and I normally have like something to keep me interested because I get bored. Well, boredom, mate, is really bloody important for learning. Don't worry about that. So today, I just turned all of the things off and I just sat on the bike, sweating it off, And I came out with about 4 or 5 things that I'm going to add to this thing today, and 4 or 5 things I'm going to take out, because I sat on my own on a bike for an hour. Whereas I normally have TED Talks going or something going, and I have pens going, I'm writing stuff down, and that's, no doubt that's a good thing. But how do you actually create boredom for yourself? Because one of the things from time to time you have to do is actually change your beliefs. And are you prepared to change your beliefs? And the reason I showed this image, it's Erin Phillips, wonderful player for the Adelaide Football Club. He's just played in front of 53,000 people in a grand final, the daughter of a famous footballer, Greg Phillips, 450 games in South Australia and Collingwood. When she was born, Greg Phillips was told, it's a pity you've got daughters. But what happened was there's a little change in an exhibition game which was played in 2013, where we changed the beliefs about the role of women in sport, or the opportunities we can create for women in elite sport. And it's still got a long way to go. There's an enormous amount of dogma. But here we have a photo of something which was actually 10 years ago, someone said was not possible because some beliefs were simply changed. And then we've created something inside the game which has changed it more than anything else. And this came out of the Melbourne Football Club in the time I was there. And this is my proudest legacy. And I'm not sure if I didn't have a transgender daughter, I'm not sure those things would have actually happened as a result of that. So are you prepared to have your beliefs change, which actually means, are you prepared to have your mind change? And therefore, are you prepared to have the courage of your curiosity? Are you prepared to come in and just exchange thoughts just for at least a period of time? And one of the main things that we're trying to create as leaders is just a simple thing, which has never, ever been more difficult. And it's this simple notion of you belong here. And in that photo, we basically had created a game where we made it impossible for women to belong at the very level where it's most important you belong. And that is as a participator in the sport itself. You get to play the game that you love. And we made it unbelievably difficult for women to belong inside the game by making it impossible for them to play at an elite level. And if we're trying to do one thing as a leader, it's to be able to answer this question: you belong here. And you belong here on the basis of your character, of what you bring, your attitude, your aptitude, your integrity, all of these sorts of things. But you belong here also on the basis of your competency, your capabilities, your track record, your skills. But you also belong here on your capacity to connect. You cannot build clarity around a role without connection. And connection is, are you influencing the performance of other people through your behaviours? Are you taking responsibility to be a good member inside a team? And I think more and more as the world goes on, that we're going to be we're searching for this thing here. And you think in a world with more communication, then it would be just easier than it's ever been. But it's never, ever, ever been harder. Simply answering the question of you belong here. So how do we do it? And again, a beautiful image taken recently, and there's a wonderful mark by one of the AFLW Melbourne players. And it's just simply, I'd say to this, that you are the coach, you are the player of your own life. And I would say most of us spend our life being the player. Not actually standing back and saying, if I was coaching me, what would I be telling me? If I had the asset of you inside my team, how would I be making the best use of what you bring? Because no one's going to do this stuff for you. And I'd just like to share another little framework, and a few of you might be a bit familiar with this, is it just builds off this simple little framework of asking yourself and saying on a daily basis, this simple question of what's important. And I do it in the form of a trademark. My trademark is finding something. And it came out of clinical depression. I realized I had to find something. And it related to my finding something related to my energy and my attention. How do I maintain high levels of energy? And how do I actually focus my attention? And like most people, I start the day with a form of a to-do list. But I'd say also that your to-do list is the person you were yesterday as a starting point. And I reckon there's probably a few people in this room who have done this one where there's something, they've got something which isn't on their to-do list. They put it on their to-do list and then tick it off. Anyone ever done that one? I reckon Julie's done that. And what your to-do list relates to action, but the main thing your to-do list is trade-offs. What are you trading off each time you do something? If you're trading off screen time for reading time, if you're trading off screen time for conversation time. Because one of the things I'm going to say is that when, and in the context of all of this stuff, it needs to actually, in fact, have context, which is maybe you should write for yourself a to-know list. And your to-know list then relates to learning. And I generally relate learning to my craft. And we're talking about the craft of leadership, the craft of self-development. There's a craft inside this, building mastery around something. It relates to your mind and it relates to your body. We need to be looking after all three, and they're very related. But I'd also say maybe you should have a context even deeper than that, which might be your to-be list, because your to-be list then goes to purpose. And I've got my simple little take on purpose is this. The purpose sits on the top of meaning, a sense of connection. And I think connecting to your craft is one of the most powerful things you can do. I deeply connect with the game of Australian football. What we love reveals us. I deeply connect to art. My mum's an artist. My father was a football administrator. My uncle umpired a grand final. I've got a cousin who played 200 games for Hawthorn. It's almost as though I had no choice. And I've given myself over to that lack of choice so many times. And the things which we love most tend to hurt us most as well. We understand that. But I've probably also realised that maybe there's a passion for learning purely as it relates to leadership, and I underestimated that in myself. And then it comes back to this other framing of belonging. Be a part of something which is bigger than you, or to create something for yourself which is bigger than you. And that's exactly what Julie has done with VID. He's created something bigger than her. And this is the gift for us. And so your trademark, your what's important, then brings together all of these elements. So whilst the conversation today is much more about the to know and the to be, it better end up on a to-do list at some stage, because that's where you're trading off. That's where you're trading off your attention at that stage. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully it makes sense. And I'll give copies of the little whiteboard notes to Julie so we can distribute them if we need to. And one of the questions you have to always ask yourself in the context of this, of you being the player and you being the coach of your own life, is just this one. And this is a wonderful Melbourne player by the name of Max Gawn. But the question I'm asking is, how serious are you about this? How serious? And I use Max Gawn as the example because when we drafted Max Gawn, we were training out at the city of Casey in Cranbourne. It was a bit of a drive out for most of the players. And this guy, it's his very, very first training session with the Melbourne Football Club. Been around for 160 years, prestigious football club, and this guy's just been drafted. And on the way to training, a few of the players have passed Max in the car as they were driving out there. And Max Gawn, about to go to his first AFL training session, was smoking in the car. He's going to play he's going to play his very first training session, turning up with cigarette smoke. And the captain of the club came in to see me and he said, Cameron, you know that bloke who we've just drafted, that big tall kid, he's 6'11". He said he was smoking in the car on the way to training. And I'm thinking, Jesus, what we've got ourselves in for here? And that can happen. You just draft the wrong player. And he came into the office, this big kid, and I said, Max, were you smoking on the way to training? And he looked at me and he said, yeah. No, there's just not one iota of, and then he looked at me and said, I'm not allowed to smoke. And it just was a lack of understanding. And then Melbourne recently drafted a fellow by the name of Majak Dor, who's got a huge story in the game. And people might remember he's of African descent and jumped off the Balti Bridge, tried to kill himself about 2 years ago and made an unbelievable recovery in the game. But his footy finished at North Melbourne and Melbourne gave him a chance. They drafted him. And there's an interview with Majak. There's a huge interest in his story. And he said, what I worked out is if I go to training, all I got to do is do whatever Max Gawn does. if I can keep up with Max Gorn, because he sets a standard like I've never seen before. So this kid who was smoking on the way to training in his very first session now sets the standard because he's serious. And I'm not saying serious without joy, because I think joy is one of the most important things you can have. But serious about the responsibility, whether it's leadership or getting the best from yourself. And in most cases, I would say from a leadership point of view, and people understand, they underestimate it, it's a skill set and a mindset. And so from that point of view, and this is Dusty Martin from last year, you need to have a system and you need to do the work. And my take is the work is just simple things done often. And I have what I'd call an opt-out system. Don't opt in to doing the work, opt out of not doing the work. So do these things in your life. If you want to build habits around them, as James Clear says, we don't rise to the level of our goal, we fall to the level of our systems. And the system is theirs, but yes, you do have to do the work. And I would start the day by asking that simple question that I mentioned before, which is just what's important. And what I'd say is just that what's important is very unlikely to be the first email in your inbox. And I read recently, I think it was Cole Fink, who involved in Thought Leaders, he said, if you are just looking at your email as to dictate your day and your life, you're basically asking your life to be dictated to by people who just happen to have your email address. And that seems crazy to me. And it was just a beautiful interpretation of it. Because in the end, if those who are in the room who are in leadership recognize you cannot outperform your leadership. No organization can do that. If I say to people, you've got a 9 out of 10 strategy, but you've got a 3 out of 10 culture, you're going to be performing to a 3 out of 10. And culture starts with leadership. Because leadership drives culture, which drives behaviours, which then in turn drives outcomes. The best part of the only chance you've got of any form of strategic execution is if you actually get your leadership right. And most of the time as leaders, and I'll finish up in a minute, but one of the most challenging things from leaders is that if we're doing leadership properly, this is the space that we operate in. And it takes a little bit of explaining, is that we're going to be faced as leaders with the most ambiguous situations, the most conflicted, the most friction built. And in fact, leaders have got to go in search of friction, because otherwise it appears at the worst possible time. You can deal with friction with clarity outside of the event, but if friction happens inside the event, you're in some strife. So our goal as leaders is to be the 49, 51 people. And so therefore, as a leader, you better make sure that you've got a whole lot of 60-40 people around you. But you also better make sure you've got to be ready to get it wrong and get it wrong often. And the simple way of thinking about this is that people do not experience your intentions, they experience your behaviours. And it's your behaviours when you're dealing with the most ambiguous and difficult issues where you're most judged. And in the end, we think of it like this. It's not what's happening inside you. It's not what's going on around you. It's how you're prepared to show up. And the number one responsibility we have of ourselves is to show up in a positive and strong way. And I just have a simple framing of this, and I'll finish off with this one. Are you behaving in a way which is above the line, or are you behaving in a way which is below the line? Are you setting standards for the teams that you're responsible for, which are above the line or below the line? My simple formula for this is this: that people think that, and I start with say SH, situation happens, a situation happens, but it's really shit happens, because that's what goes on. And people say situation happens equals outcome. No, situation happens times our response equals outcome. And a situation happens here will have both context and it'll have content associated with it. And that situation happens is something which is happening around you. And if you handle that thing in a way, you have a tendency to drift, and you drift below the line. And the way you know you're drifting below the line is when you start blaming, you start criticizing, and you start deflecting. And the one thing I know about all of those things is that they make friends really quickly, really quickly. We can't do that if you want to be a leader. You then have to have a reflection on what's happening inside you. And you have to have a capacity to shift. And your shift is back above the line. And you can demand it of others because you're modeling it yourself. Leadership is not what you proclaim, it's what you permit. And in fact, what you permit is really what you practice in lots of ways. And so it's about taking responsibility. But it's actually radical responsibility. And radical responsibility is getting away from the blame, criticism, deflection. And the worst form of blame is when you blame yourself. Yes, take responsibility. And we get beaten in games. We might have been beaten by 15 goals. And I'd be driving home in the car, I'd be sitting there with my wife. And I'd go, I think I'm fucking this whole thing up. I think I'm making a mess of this. And she'd look at me and say, you let us think like that for the next 2 hours. And it's a beautiful piece of advice. And so what would happen is I'd go home and I'd put the game on again, because the game goes for about 2 hours. And as the game's being played, as hard as it was to watch the game again, ideas and thoughts were going through my mind. And I started to formulate how I was going to show up. And I realized that the role that I had and the responsibilities that I had required me to be calm, humble, and brave. And the times when I wasn't those things, and it was often, I almost look back with a little bit of that sense of shame when I wasn't calm, humble. Because by doing those things, at least I was showing up with authenticity. And I think of authenticity as an outcome. And the requirement of authenticity was vulnerability. Walk in the room and say, I don't have the answer here, even though people want you to walk in the room with the answer. And with that outcome, if you handled it in a calm and humble brave, hopefully you created a new situation happens, which is much better than the one you've left. So our defining thing as a leader is in the art, is how we handle the response. And you need to be able to go deep. This was the drawing I did following that very last day, my something to be day, my last day in footy. And the line I use is a David White line, and it was to capture just the weight of leadership and where it had left me, if you like. As wonderful as it was a very heavy burden at different times. And the term is simply this: when your eyes are tired, the world looks tired. The thing we're trying to protect ourselves from more than anything else when we go through this is that very idea. And my only advice to all of us is that, yes, put yourself into an environment where inspiration happens. We do have to be able to live it. But in the end, it also has to find you working. My final little line is, this is a quick drawing I did of these young kids running up and down an oval. And we can all relate to that. At some stage in our life, we've run up and down a ground. We've competed. It is an instinctive aspect of who we are to compete. And what I say with this is that there is always a race. There is always a race. But velocity is never, ever the answer for complexity. Never has and never will be. So take yourself back into that learning and slow down. And slow down. So hopefully you've been able to get something from all of that. I think I'm pretty much on time, Julia. That's not bad for me, is it? Actually, I can normally, I have had a tendency to go over. So I'm more than happy to throw it open for some questions and some thoughts, and let's go for it.